otherwise.
All right. I want to move to our second topic for discussion tonight. It's obviously a touchy one for me. It's about the CBC, so I'm going to let you kind of talk amongst yourselves on this one for a while. But let me set the scene. The last couple of weeks there's been a lot of discussion about the public broadcaster, and it's ranged from the leadership to the budget to the funding to the programming of the corporation. The last week especially, the two newspapers that call themselves national, one owned by the same company that owns CTV, the other that's owned by the same company that runs Global, has run a number of different articles and columns about the CBC, and that's been interesting reading, especially for those of us inside the CBC. But it does raise the question, whither the corporation? Where is it heading? How should it be funded? What about its programming? All these are legitimate questions at any time for a public corporation. So I want to hear where you stand on this. Andrew, you've written extensively over the years about the CBC and your concerns and feelings about it. So why don't you launch us, and then Alan, then Chantal. As I said, I'm going to try and stay out of this as much as I can. Go for it. This is your chance. Andrew.
Well, you were right to point out that all the media are in crisis. There's all kinds of vested interests involved. I think this is, as the cliche has it, an opportunity for the CBC as much as a crisis. That is to say, to free itself from its two masters that it's now answered to, one being the advertising revenues and the other being government funding, neither of which has been particularly satisfactory for the corporation, neither of which has been particularly faithful. It's been very fickle. And the model I would prefer to see the corporation moving to would be pay TV, to put it on pay, to have a direct relationship with its viewers. I think that's the best way to resolve this age-old dilemma that the CBC's always been caught in between, should it try to be a broad populist network, in which case a lot of the distinction between it and the private network starts to disappear, or should it try to be a narrow elite broadcaster, in which case it runs into that issue of why should the broad mass of the public pay for a network that only a minority are watching. I think the real indicator these days of quality in TV is not so much between public and private. You can pick 20 programs out of the listings at random, and I defy people to tell which is which. The real indicator these days is that the really good programming is on the pay channels like HBO, where you have a passionate, committed audience that's paying for the programming it's watching. I think that's the best model in the long term for the CBC.
Well, I agree with Andrew's analysis, but none of his prescriptions. I mean, there's no question that public broadcasting and the CBC has been under threat for a long time. I mean, first the advent of specialty channels basically ate away a lot of the unique programming mandate of the public broadcaster. Now in a digital world, I mean, what is news anymore? Anyone wants to find out what's happening in election results, for example, doesn't need to watch election returns on television. They can program it into their computer. But we lose sight of the larger issue, is that, public broadcaster and the CBC is not a business. It is public enterprise. It is a public service, a media service designed not simply to amuse or to gain a huge audience night after night after night by appealing to the lowest common denominator, but by creating better citizens, by informing us more about our country, each other, and drawing us into a shared and collective experience. And that is something that only the public sector can facilitate, and that we would be very, very short-sighted if we lost sight of that fundamental fact because of these short-term problems.
I don't think that you can actually have a cultural policy enunciated on the basis of an economic crisis, and basically that's what we're watching, and I don't find that the debate is really on a level playing field on that basis. 2 points. I look at how the Conservatives are handling the CBC in this downturn, and it seems to me that there's a danger that the CBC is their version of the gun registry, something that you starve through the back door, because you cannot go up front to Parliament and have a real debate over the place of the CBC in society. But I'm struck also by the fact that there is no debate in French over Radio-Canada and its role, its essential role in Quebec society. And you can't starve the CBC or make it a pay TV without touching Radio-Canada. And if you think culture was an issue in the last election, if someone thinks that you can even through the back door kill Radio-Canada and get away with it, the Conservatives would be in, A, for a big surprise, and B, the fact that they're actually doing what they're doing now tells me that they've basically given up on Quebec and votes from Quebec for the foreseeable future.
I think also I take exception with Andrew's notion that there's nothing different between the public sector and the private sector broadcaster. I mean, the fact that we're on the air right now on the CBC is no coincidence. I mean, left to their own devices, the private broadcaster, if it wasn't a condition of license, probably wouldn't run the news. They'd run Survivor and the Amazing Race over and over again because it would get a bigger audience. I mean, part of the job in a multimedia world is to create context and understanding and analysis, and that is something that uniquely the public broadcaster will do and the private broadcaster won't.
Well, the assumption there is that nobody would pay for that. And in fact, there are many different audiences. There are audiences that will pay for discerning, television. The fact that the idea that the only people who would ever pay for that is through the taxes, I think, is contrary to the facts. I'm not saying there's no distinction between the public and the private. I absolutely think there is. I'm saying for the sake of the CBC's employees as much as for its audience, if it's going to depend upon the fickle tastes of the public funders, of the politicians, it's always going to be facing this crisis. So you're right to say we shouldn't be making decisions, Chantal, based upon short-term economic crises. But this has been a long-term, ongoing problem for the CBC, is not knowing where its next dollar is going to come from. It's also been a problem for the viewers that there's very many people who would say CBC, particularly English TV, has been lacking in quality on a lot of different fronts. And the answer to both those problems, in my view, is having a much more intense connection between the programmers and the viewers. There are viewers out there who want and will pay for exactly the kind of quality TV you're talking about, Alan. So the notion that that can only be paid for by subsidy, I just think is illogical.
Okay, we've got a minute left, so it's closing arguments and short. Chantal first.
I think that having a public broadcaster is not a service that you pay for because it's a luxury. It's part of nation building. I think it's important for English Canadians because they are so spread out across the country that this is one of the rare links that they have to each other. And it's of course essential for Quebecers and for Francophones in Canada because that is the way that they keep a society operating around the culture, and at least in French, culture is part of identity, and it is something that is as essential as a language.
All right, Alan, you're next, and short, I'm sorry.
Public funding is essential so that there is independence. And then again, in today's multimedia environment, in the digital world, what we need more than anything else is authority and trust and confidence. And that is something that comes with the independence that only, again, a public broadcaster can have.
Okay, we've only got 10 seconds, Andrew.
There's lots of public services that we pay for directly, trains, buses, et cetera. There's no reason in particular why you couldn't pay directly, at least in part, for the CBC as well.
All right. And you'll offer up your dollar to start that?
Absolutely. I'll be first in line.
Just your speaking fee in Chicago tonight. We'll leave it at that. Listen, thanks very much. A very interesting way of having a discussion. Andrew's in Chicago, Alan in Toronto, and Chantal in Montreal. Well, you want more At Issue? Head to our website. We have an extensive At Issue archive. And while you're there, you can also subscribe to the podcast.